Welcome to the fourth in the series on God and science. And today we're going to be talking about self-organization and chaos theory. But before we get into that, I want to tell you just briefly about an experiment that's being done by a scientist named Moroni, and this was in a weekly edition of Nature News, a very reputable science magazine. And they're doing a test to be able to answer questions that have lingered for decades. The questions include, can a particle really be in many places at the same time? Is the universe continually dividing itself into parallel worlds, each with an alternative version of ourselves? Is there such a thing as an objective reality at all? No. Well, I'm going to assume there's an objective reality so I can proceed to tell you about some things about how it works. If it turns out there isn't, you can get a refund on the cost of this class. But I don't know where you'd go to get it. So, okay, chaos theory that you've probably heard some things about. And probably the best known way of describing this is that a butterfly flapping its wings in the rainforest in South America triggers a series of fluctuations that result in a hurricane somewhere else in the world. And basically, the idea with chaos theory is just very tiny changes in the initial conditions of a system can produce very different results. And that's one reason why the weather is so hard to forecast. They're getting better at it, but in many systems that are very well understood, there's equations for them. If something's off in, let's say, the 6th decimal place, which you couldn't even make something that precise, generally, after a while, the system is in a very different state than it is if it's like 1 point different in that decimal point. So, and that is why it's impossible to predict very far into the future how even physical phenomena are going to work. But also over time, many rules and laws about chaos theory have come to be understood. And one is that systems that are in movement tend to organize to higher states. And they go through an intermediate chaotic process. So in the in-between state, it just looks like random whatnot, but then what they emerge into is something that you couldn't have predicted or known about from the initial conditions. So things evolve in a way that's discontinuous. It's not just this smooth, a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. A seed might be a good example of that. If I hand you a seed and I don't tell you what kind of plant it is and say, here, you can put it under the electron microscope and you can carbon date it to see how old it is and so on. You can weigh it and do all kinds of physical tests. You'd have no earthly idea of what it's going to turn out to be. And even if I tell you what kind of seed it's going to be, and I say, well, I want you to draw me a picture of exactly what this plant is going to look like, how the leaves and the stems are going to go, what the fruits are going to look like, how many fruits are going to be produced. It would be impossible to do that because it's so dependent on so many factors that nobody could predict what's going to happen. Well, we live in a universe that is an evolving chaotic system. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in the old days, and I'm talking about the very old days, the ancient Greeks thought the world was just static. And there were things that were mirrors of eternal archetypes or ideas. They just didn't change. Systems theory, on the other hand, which is a much more modern way of understanding the world, sees that there's dynamic interactions as a central principle in every aspect of reality. Okay? And while we can't ever get at the whole totality, I mean, for one, the physical universe is too big for us to be able to ever there's parts where the light will never get to us because space is expanding. We can have an understanding of what the nature of the larger universe is by examining what we do have control over. And many things in life have what's called a fractal structure. And this is the pattern of fern plants. It's the pattern of many different things that have a repeating structure, but it's not identical. Okay, and maybe you've seen computer programs that show these things that look like Peter Max Paisley drawings. But if you have a computer program that shows how a system that has that equation changes over time and you can magnify it up or downwards, it always has a feature called self-similarity, but it's never identical. It doesn't repeat, on down to infinity smaller and infinity larger. So our universe is kind of like that in some ways. And while we can't get at the whole thing, we can explore what I like to call our fractal neighborhood. We kind of get an understanding of the vicinity, and that we can generalize that to larger things. Okay. So what does spirituality have to say in relation to self-organization and chaos theory, although generally the spiritual traditions didn't have those terms or even knowledge of those terms in the past, so they had other ways of describing it. Well, the Sufis have a wonderful way of describing the phenomena of a system going through a seeming breakdown of the way that it's been and an emergence into a higher state. And the words are, one is fana, F-A-N-A, which the literal meaning is annihilation, which sounds pretty awful. I mean, who wants to be annihilated? But really, you could apply these words to if a caterpillar had self-awareness but didn't know what was going to happen in the future. It just knew it was conscious of its current state. So imagine you're a caterpillar, and you get this instinctive impulse to start spinning a cocoon. Why am I spinning this thing to entrap myself? And then you're in the cocoon, and your body liquefies. And you're not going to be a happy camper. It's like, but lo and behold, you emerge as a butterfly. Well, the caterpillar could not possibly have an inkling of what it was going to become. I mean, it's such a different state of being from the caterpillar. So it went through an annihilation of its previous state, and baka means rebirth or resurrection. It's an emergence into a higher state of being. Well, when we think about spirituality, we might think of, okay, we have, depending on the religious tradition. So Christianity, fana would be physical death, and what would baka be? Anybody? Resurrection. But you'd think of that probably as a one-time phenomena. I mean, you resurrect, and then you're done, you're cooked, you're in this higher state of being. But in actuality, the way the universe appears to be working, it's an unending progression of fana and baka, and then a breakdown of that into an even higher state of being. And I'm going to be talking about some theories about emergence, both from science and then my theory applying it to spirituality. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
That you can address here. How, I mean, I've discussed this with friends. If time, if the present, past, and future are all right here, how does reincarnation factor into that, or resurrection?
Well, I can't resist throwing in some humor into this. A bumper sticker I would like to see is "There's no future in past lives." And personally, I think there's enough to deal with in this one to be too concerned. Is there reincarnation? And different spiritual groups have different ways, and that would take us too far afield. That would be the topic of a whole other class or more than one. But the short answer I would give is I think that the fullness of who we really are exists in multiple levels of what we perceive as reality simultaneously, although English doesn't work too well because at the same time sounds like it's at this moment on the clock, and there's a connection between past and future experiences, but that's as much as I can really get into that question right now. Okay, so there's a couple other terms from Sufism, and one is called Hal, H-A-L, which means a peak experience. And many, many people have had peak experiences, whether or not you're involved in some spiritual process. A lot of times they're just spontaneous kinds of things, where just something out of the blue, you're in an altered state of much clearer awareness. And it's very wonderful, and when you come out of it, it's like, how can I get back to that? It's so much more enjoyable than this usual humdrum day-to-day, but it's a temporary experience, and I like to think of it as a sneak preview of what could be to come. And the other term is maqam, M-A-Q-A-M, which means station. So a station means a more lasting condition. So in a chaotic system, there's the initial state, and then it self-organizes to a higher state. But that's not the final destination like the Greeks thought. You get to that eternal archetype after a time. Then there's further growth and self-organization and the chaotic breakdown and emergence to an even higher state. So there's no end to these stations. And I personally think life would be very dull if there ever could be the finish line. If you were... So I challenge you to think of, make up a notion of what you picture the afterlife might be, but imagine it being this kind of constant, however wonderful, heavenly music and the angels singing for all eternity, and that's very beautiful, but after a couple quadrillion years you might go, I'd like to hear some heavy metal or something. Okay. So let's talk about the way these stages of organization just work in life in different arenas. Well, one is in our cognitive development. So the cognition of an infant is certainly different than that of a toddler, is different from an elementary school child, and so on. And if you're familiar with Piaget, he had these wonderful stages he identified, which I'll briefly describe, and there'll be a reason for this in a minute because I think it applies to our spirituality as well. So the first one is the sensory motor stage. The infant just learns that he or she is separate from the environment, learns how to manipulate objects, kind of learns like if you pick something up, it falls, and something disappears behind a screen, it's still there, object permanence, and so on. Then there's the pre-operational stage where children have magical thinking, concrete operations, logical thinking but very rigid, can't really do abstract reasoning, formal operations, logic, deductive reasoning, and so on. And so hopefully we've all made it up into formal operations, although you wonder with some of the things going on in the news today if some people just didn't quite get that far. Okay, so here's why one of the reasons I brought this up. Piaget had these different terms. And as I describe these, I want you to think about how your notion of God and spirituality has changed throughout your life. More than likely, it wasn't just a little bit more added on here or there. There were probably some significant discontinuities in the way you saw things. You really had to let go of old ways of thinking and allow some different understanding to enter. So a schema is a category of knowledge that helps us interpret and understand the world. So for Piaget, a schema was a category of knowledge and the way of getting that knowledge. For example, a child, and this is nice because it's Blessing the Animals Day, a child may have a schema about what a dog is, but if the child has only ever seen small dogs, what might the child think? All dogs are small, furry, cuddly, friendly, and have 4 legs. But then the child encounters a St. Bernard. Wait a minute, this doesn't fit with the schema. Well, the child takes in the new information, has to modify that category in his or her mind to include that. So that's a schema. Assimilation. You're taking in new information to the previous way you saw things. That's called assimilation. So in this case, the child seeing a dog, labeling it a dog, being taught dog, cat, and so on, is a way of assimilating this into the child's schema of what a dog is. Well, you can flip the dog around to God and kind of think about how this has changed for you over time. Then comes accommodation, altering your schema in light of new information. So it's like, dogs are eventually mammals, 4-legged animals that have these characteristics, and so on. And then you develop a new way of looking at things. And then finally, a phenomena called, and the terms aren't so much as important as just realizing there's these ways that these shifts take place. Equilibration equilibration. Okay, this means children try to strike a balance between what they assimilate and how they accommodate. So this is the balance between the previous knowledge and the new information. And now, if you've been here for the series, you're a physicist, and you've learned about Tiller's research on subtle energy. Well, you've got a schema about the physical world that these are the basic laws of physics, and they're carved in stone, and they can't change. The laws of thermodynamics can never vary. But now, here's a research study, one research study, that's showing this is totally different, and this nutcase is talking about subtle energy. And remember, you're the physicist here with your old schemas. But if you're an open-minded skeptic, I've used that term before, you might go, well, this sounds crazy, but I'm a scientist, so I'll look at the research. I'll try to replicate it. This guy's onto something. Well, you've got to modify your assumptions about the world in light of new evidence, and you're going to go through kind of a shaky period, a breakdown of the old way, a kind of a fana, a shattering of your old assumptions, and a baka, a reorganization to a new way of seeing the world that allows for possibilities that in your previous way couldn't happen. Like the physicist I told you about that listened to Tiller present his research, and his response to Tiller was, even if what you say is true, I don't believe it. Well, that one is never going to move on to the next stage. And the way that I would say a significant number of people deal with new information that's contrary to their schema, their assumptions, is to say it's not true, it's a lie, it's fabricated, they're off the deep end, they don't know what they're doing, they're incompetent, and so on, and find more people that have the same schema and assumptions that you do, and what happens then, it becomes self-reinforcing. Well, look, all these people that I know and respect and trust think the same way, so obviously we're right, and what? They're wrong. So this is one reason why I think over the centuries there have been such conflicts and wars brought about by religion and people that are very sincere in their belief system. Because if they are convinced their belief system is true and everyone else is either evil, mistaken, or whatever, and they need to either convert them or get rid of them, well, you're going to have some problems, right? So even though self-organization is a natural process, and these stages of stations, maqam, and then moving on to the next one, are natural process, it's the way that life is seeking to evolve, it's quite possible to resist those changes, but what happens is the more someone resists the emergence of what's trying to come through, the more chaotic and difficult things get. And the person can deal with that by just grabbing on even tighter to what they believe in, or just really fighting. And we can probably all think of times in our own lives where we had our own internal struggles about something trying to organize to a higher state in our way of understanding, but we can grow very comfortable in the station that we've been in. Well, we know how to deal with this, things are nice, and I'm just going to assume everything's going to continue along the same pathway that it's been on, but then the rug gets yanked out from under us. Well, if the tendency is to try to just recreate the way that things were, then the rug really gets yanked out, and we're like Charlie Brown and Lucy in the football, you know, keep falling flat on our backs. Okay. So there are other systems, being a psychologist, that have in psychology have looked at stages. Erickson's had developmental stages. The children have gone through like the different tasks of different ages, like just mention a few: early childhood, developing a sense of personal control and independence, school age, social and academic demands, adolescence, developing personal identity, young adults forming loving and intimate relationships, on into maturity, older adults looking back on life and hopefully feeling a sense of fulfillment and wisdom and so on. Kohlberg has stages of moral development, which I won't really go into, but I'm bringing these up because in many different ways of looking at what happens to people as we go through our life cycles, there are these distinct stages that there's a natural progression through. And nobody's, handing us a book saying, now it's time for you to do so-and-so. This is just what is supposed to happen if all goes well. And Maslow, that probably many of you have heard about, has the hierarchy of human needs. These I will mention. The basic one is just biological needs: air, food, drink, shelter, warmth, sex, sleep, and so on. Safety needs: security, protection from the elements, law, and so on. Belongingness, love needs: work, family, affection. Esteem needs: self-esteem, achievement, mastery. And then it's only if you've got what you need in one of these previous need hierarchies that you are in a position to go on to a higher one. So the last one is what he calls self-actualization needs: realizing personal potential, self-fulfillment, seeking personal growth, and peak experiences. So Diane and I have been teaching meditation to different people for more than 40 years, but we probably wouldn't have much success pulling over when a homeless person's on underneath an underpass saying, "Here, why don't you come sit in the car, it's nice and cool, I'm going to teach you how to meditate." I'd say, "Well, I want something to eat, or I need a job." I mean, they're not in a place where that's at all relevant to them. Okay, so in a way, self-actualization is a luxury that's brought about by being in the position that at least many people in our country are in, where they could if they wanted to, because the bases are already covered. Okay. Now let me talk about something you've probably heard about called a paradigm shift. So paradigm shift, well, let me read you the description from Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolution and really defined this idea. Paradigm shift is a change from one way of thinking to another. It's a revolution, a transformation, a sort of metamorphosis. It does not just happen, but is driven by agents of change. Okay? And he talks about in this book, which is very enlightening, about the resistance to not only individuals but to societies in undergoing paradigm shifts. And I've talked at the first class about the major paradigm shifts that have happened in science, and then religion would usually follow some centuries later sometimes in the worldview, from the notion that everything revolved around the earth to the notion that everything was just static and didn't evolve. Pardon me. To Newtonian physics, which works very well up to a certain point, that things are just engaged in causality, cause and effect. The billiard ball model of the universe, if you knew the location and the energy of every subatomic particle, then you could predict everything in the future and also back in time in the past, because it's a clockwork. Obviously the universe doesn't work that way. Quantum mechanics has sort of blown that out of the water. But the notions of God have kind of followed the model of science, particularly the Newtonian notion of the universe, which dualistic, separation between everything, and God in particular is the ultimate separation. There's God, and then there's manifestation, and things I've talked about in the previous classes about how religions have viewed what manifestation is about, what people are about, what the purpose is about, and so on. So let me pause here and see if you have any questions so far. Or are you all in the intermediate state of chaos?
Some of this applies to the times we're living in right now, the shift in our society.
Yeah. And you can see the polarization that takes place prior to, I'd say, a mass paradigm shift. In other words, the way different people view the phenomena of global warming. And there's some very sincere people that think it's absolutely not happening. It's a myth, and just the projections and so on. But the polarization that happens, because if you're in a dualistic notion of yourself in relation to reality, and you think there is the right point of view, then obviously the other point of view is wrong, And you can have different degrees of trying to combat or counter the other point of view. And I think that in one way, the short summary of history is just the nature of the rocks has changed in wars. Instead of rocks, we have atomic bombs, and now we have cyber warfare, and so on. But the basic kinds of struggle have just persisted, but the rationales, the underlying rationales, are not all that different than they were a very long time ago. Okay. So I mentioned at the start this research this guy Moroni is doing to answer the question, is there an objective reality at all? And then another scientist named Jeremy England is researching the question, and these are scientists researching these questions, not philosophers or mystics. Why does life exist? So scientists have their theories about how life emerged on the Earth. Maybe it was seeded by matter that was brought about by comets, and there's some very recent evidence. NASA has landed some vehicles on some comets and analyzed and found there's some essential building blocks of life that are on at least some of these comets that could explain how that got to Earth and enabled life to evolve through what Darwin talks about. Well, this scientist, whose name is Jeremy England, has a really interesting idea I just came across very recently that I didn't know anything about. And his theory is that if you have, based on the principles of established physics, oh, thank you. So you can get it out. If you have a group of atoms driven by an external source of energy like the sun or chemical fuel and surrounded by heat bath like the ocean or atmosphere, the atoms will gradually restructure themselves in order to release more energy, increasingly more energy. This could mean under certain conditions matter acquires the key physical attribute associated with life. So this is a fascinating theory, and it's testable. He's proposed some experiments that could really test this theory, that matter self-organizes based on the laws of physics, and this new principle he's proposing in order that it can release more heat into the environment. Well, when that happens, the structure that is releasing that more heat becomes more and more self-organized. It has, last week I talked about entropy disorder. The disorder in that clump of atoms is moving towards decreasing, more self-organization, while the environment is getting more heat released. And this only takes place in an open system. Well, the world is an open system. It's not in a closed container in a laboratory. So what England has to say is you start with a random clump of atoms, and if you shine light on it for long enough, it should not be so surprising that you get a plant. I mean, to me, this is really fascinating. And you're going to see where I'm going to go with my theory about this applied to spirituality. So this is not meant to replace Darwin's theory of evolution, but it is saying that Darwinian evolution is a special case of a larger phenomena, a more general phenomena. Okay. And he has even a mathematical equation. He says we can show very simply from this formula that the most likely evolutionary outcomes are going to be ones that absorb and then released more energy into the environment. Okay? And there's two ways he says this can happen. One is self-replication. A structure that reproduces itself can release more energy. And RNA, which is a pretty essential molecule for life, is a very efficient way of doing this. So he's proposing this may be one reason why RNA evolved, was to enable this self-replication to occur and more energy to be released in the environment. And the other is to have greater structural organization. A plant is much better at capturing and routing solar energy than an unstructured heap of carbon atoms. Thus, England argues that under certain conditions, matter will spontaneously self-organize. This tendency could account for the internal order of living things and of many inanimate structures as well. So another scientist who's a biological physicist said that Jeremy England's theory is making this other scientist think about that the distinction between living and non-living matter is not sharp, because they found just chemical systems that do this same kind of thing. They spontaneously self-organize, self-replicate, and release more energy into the environment. So there have been some experiments that are already, I think they're in process now to test his theory, which to me is way cool. But what makes it even cooler is my theory, which is... Thank you. I'll see you in Stockholm. Because I like the universe to make sense to me, okay? And so you might recall that I talked before about what the Sufis say about why was there a creation in the first place. And their beautiful explanation is that God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, to be loved, and so God brought about an existence so there could be this relationship that would enable God to know him herself. Okay, and further, some great Sufis, one being Ibn Arabi, say that God bestows upon the human being a modality of being, and in return, it's not just a one-way street. Human beings confer upon God a modality of knowing. And the Sufis say that God can only know him herself through the experience of beings in existence. I don't think that's, this is blessing animals. I don't think it's particular to humans, but humans are self-conscious, so it's probably more so through humans than most other life forms. Okay, so if you can say that the spiritual purpose of there being an existence is for God to know him herself, that means there has to be a process that arises in existence, an evolution, for one, to self-awareness of beings, because there's not much that you can know, from what a rock knows about itself. But a person is able to have conscious experiences, and the Sufis say that the light that descends in manifestation is transformed through our experiences in life, and that light is returned, and the knowledge is transformed, the wisdom. It's like wisdom is increased through every experience that we have. Okay, so let me go back to Jeremy England's theory about the purposes, one, dissipating heat, but also having, what goes with this, a correlate of this is having more self-organization. When there's more self-organization, there's decreased entropy, there's decreased disorder. You could say more information is available. So let's say, my theory, a higher purpose of existence than just the thermodynamic one, dissipating heat, more structure. A higher purpose is increasing wisdom or increasing information, not factual information, but well, I gave a description last time, so I'm not going to go into that again right now, but kind of a higher order wisdom that's distilled from experiences. So if that's a higher purpose of existence, then us awakening in life, the Sufis talk about, and becoming capable of more and more consciously participating in what Maslow calls self-actualization, and what Tiller talks about the linking of the subtle into the manifest. And you might recall I said one of the things that happened there was the disorder in the laboratory decreased. There was more order. There was more information available. So it may well be, and this is what I believe, that a natural property of there being an existence at all, whatever the reason why it started in the first place, is this furtherance of more and more information or what can be known. And I mentioned before about Seth Lloyd, this computer scientist at MIT, theorizing that the universe is a gigantic quantum computer, and what is it computing? Itself. It's trying to understand itself. Well, whatever terms you want to use, scientific terms, religious terms, spiritual terms, mystical terms, there seems to be some agreement here that the underlying purpose is an increasing knowledge and increasing wisdom. So I believe there is an inherent emergent principle in us, in our lives, or you could say even in our souls, this drive towards increasing understanding and increasing capacity to participate in this interconnected reality that we're all a part of. So that would be another way of thinking about spirituality. We're actually furthering the divine purpose. The greater and greater we're able not only to awaken to our own potentialities, but our interactions with other beings that have their own unique ways of perceiving and their unique wisdom that can come through them. And then you put two people or more together and you have the phenomena of a light upon a light, and now you have new things that are able to arise that couldn't even from either person separately. So let me pause here and see if someone would like to ask a question about all that. So I've just given you my theory about why there's existence and emerging consciousness and the direction we're going in. So we're all in agreement. It's approved.
What are you going to call it, Tom?
The whole kit and caboodle theory. Okay, so let me go on a little bit more here. There's a biologist named Stuart Kaufman who's just a genius. And he has done a lot of writing about self-organization and so on as it applies to biology. And he has this term he uses called the adjacent possible. Well, we have our different amino acids that we're composed of. And if you take every permutation of the different amino acids, there's more possible combinations, ways of arranging them, than there are electrons in the universe. So this is an interesting one. If, in fact, our universe is going to die a cold death and all the protons will decay after trillions and trillions of years, even in that period of time, just through random mutation, you could never have manifest all the possible ways of arranging the amino acids in our DNA. So not all of them could ever happen. So how do they, quote, decide how to go? Well, some of the combinations, you're dead. You know, if you're born with certain genetic defects, you might as well forget about it because you couldn't even be alive, or not, you wouldn't be alive for very long. And others move in a direction that are more positive. And so he says the adjacent possible is the space of possibilities in which that DNA could mutate, where life can continue, but the tendency is for it to move in towards a higher order of complexity. And to survive, autonomous agents, living organisms, have had to evolve towards a higher complexity. So it's inherent that it's going to move towards that higher complexity. So we're evolving, you could say, in our spirituality, always towards the adjacent possible. Our teacher, Diana, my teacher in the Sufis, Pir Vilayat, had this wonderful term he would use, the next step. What's the next step on your path? What's the next possible step on your spiritual journey in the space of all the different possibilities? Now, stepping off the edge of the Grand Canyon would not allow your spiritual journey to continue very far, so that would probably not be a very adaptive next step. But other next steps, being open to new learning, doing different experiences, learning techniques, like Diane's Monday night is a way of having practices that are going to help further developing the ideas that I talk about in the Sunday classes and make them sort of stick, or giving you a nucleus that you can move further. So I would encourage you, if you're able to check that out. But we're moving in this direction towards the adjacent possible, hopefully not standing still. Pir Vilayat would say this wonderful quote, "The pull of the future is stronger than the push of the past." Okay? And I've talked before about computer models of life. They're computer simulations where they put in a few simple rules and watch what happens. And these evolve into very complex things. They're still on the computer, but they're analogous to what happens in the, quote, real world. I mentioned this before about societies and trade and viruses and wars and things like that, all from this simple set of rules, and you never could have predicted this. So it just seems to be carved into the fabric of there being in anything, even if it's a virtual computer world or the living world of the universe that we're in, that this principle of self-organization applies, and that there's a push or a pull, like Pure Light said, the pull of the future, towards greater self-organization. And then you can kind of step off the train and look at, like Jeremy England's wonderful theory about, well, what might be a reason why this phenomena exists? Well, it's a dissipation of heat, and it requires self-organization. But now, to kind of put a different take on this, I'm going to talk about a Buddhist principle called dependent co-arising. Now, I think pretty much all of us are conditioned to think in terms of this thing caused that thing. You know, how did I get in this jam? Well, it's because of ABC happened and this and that. But it's very difficult for us to think in terms of what's really happening with the wave in the ocean. You know, we just see the wave going, but really the whole ocean is arising in the form of that wave. It's not separated from the rest of the ocean, but we perceive it. You know, here this wave is breaking on the shore. Okay? So what dependent co-arising means is everything arises through mutual conditioning in reciprocal interaction, a two-way interaction. So it's like everything is the cause of everything else simultaneously. Now again, that's, talk about a paradigm shift. It's hard to get used to thinking this way, but it makes all kind of sense. And the other term is dynamic interdependence. And this is from a book called Mutual Causality in Buddhism and General Systems Theory. Fascinating book. A little challenging, but I liked it anyway. So these are some quotes from this book. Reality is a dynamically interdependent process with no element held to be unchangeable or autonomous. There's nothing in reality that isn't changing, and there's nothing in reality that's truly separated from everything else. Causality is a function of relationship brought about by the interaction of multiple factors where cause and effect cannot be isolated or traced unidirectionally. So you can look at it and go, well, this caused this, but if you could really see what's going on with the whole thing, both of them were the cause of the other one, or neither was the cause of the other one. The organized whole found in nature is an open system which maintains itself by exchanging matter, energy, and information with its environment. These flow through the system and are transformed by it. So last time I talked about the quantum vacuum and things coming in and out of the quantum vacuum, and theories of some scientists that the quantum vacuum may be kind of the storehouse of all the information in all of existence. And here this is saying in this theory of dependent co-arising that matter, energy, and information continually flow through the whole thing and are continually transformed. Okay? The universe is made up not of things, but of flows and relationships. So that's, I think that would be a good thing to meditate on. Just think of that. The universe is not made up of things like we think of. I'm here, you're there, here's chairs, the building, and so on. But of flows and relationships. And the only way that we do and can understand anything is by the effect on the relationship that we are in with everything else, even though we tend to put on our Newtonianly conditioned hat of thinking that we're totally separated from what we're trying to understand or experience, and we can objectively, but in actuality we're studying what happens in the relationship. And so that you can definitely do science, and Tiller's doing this, what happens when you change the relationship with the subtle and the manifest. Well, you can't step out of manifestation, and we really can't step out of what the mystics call subtle reality, but we can not be aware of it, and in which case the effect of that is negligible. So we can't step out of the kettle of soup that we're in, but we can look and see what happens in the relationships with it. Okay? And this is, again, from this book on Buddhism, but the Sufis would say the same thing, the knower and the known do not exist independently of each other. And in Sufism, they're always talking about things in threes. Of course, we have the Trinity here, but this is a little bit different. And this would be the knower, the known, and the act of knowing. We tend to just pull that apart. I'm the knower, knowing something about that which I'm knowing about. Three different things. But in actuality, there's one phenomena that's happening in circulation where all three of these, you can't have one of these without the other two parts in relationship with each other. And this is a really important point for what I'm trying to get across here. So do y'all follow what I'm saying? And then you could put this in a lot of different things. There's the seer, the seen, and the act of seeing. There's the lover, love, and the beloved. Well, if you've got a lover and there's nothing to love, you can't have a beloved. And if you have a beloved but the act of love is not there, you don't have a lover. You have to have all three. So all three of these are going on all the time. But our minds, once again, we don't have realize how deeply conditioned we are to parcel realities into chunks. How do we do that? We parcel into dualistic chunks. That's the biggest one, me and everything else. And that goes crosswise in manifestation. But we tend to do the same thing with however we think about God, me and God. And, okay, what's my relationship here? Well, sometimes I experience sacredness or Holy Spirit or so on. And I'm not demeaning any of this. I'm just saying that's how we tend to perceive it. But in actuality, all these things are interplaying with each other all the time. And we only sometimes enter into a deeper experience of the reality in which we actually exist. And when that happens, oftentimes we have a hall, that temporary condition that we're trying to get back to, that we think of as being someplace else than where we actually dwell, because it's so different from the condition our consciousness is typically in. Do y'all follow what I'm saying here? The thing that we had the experience of is no place but here. It's not far away. In fact, it's much closer than what we think of as this world that we're in. And in the Quran, it says God is closer to you than your jugular vein. It's so present you can't even... language just doesn't work. Because if you're present to something, it sounds like you're here and it's there and you're kind of getting the perfume from it. But you're having a closer experience of the way that things actually are, because your sense of separation from that larger reality has been loosened, and now you're able to get a taste of this much deeper reality. But then when we come back to our usual conditioned thinking, we think that what we experienced was someplace distant and hard to get to, and certainly a very different state than this. And we think, well, this world is certainly a mess. Well, it is certainly a mess, but the true nature of the world that we're really in is much more wonderful than the apparent appearance of the external environment. And I've said this, I don't know how many times here and to whoever will listen, I think ultimately the solutions to some of the problems that have been present for humanity throughout history are never going to be solved until there's a huge paradigm shift in humanity. And the mystics have been saying this for a long time, but scientists are starting to say something like this. Until we really realize the interconnected reality that we're a part of, I'd say that's step one, because if you really realize that, there's not a question anymore about, well, is there global warming or not? Well, what are we going to do to save our planet or save humanity, and so on. But the other very important step is what will happen when humanity awakens to a higher potentiality of consciousness, in which people become aware of the much deeper reality on which we all exist. And remember this space of the adjacent possible? And Tiller, what can happen in that laboratory when the subtle's been linked with the manifest. Now the space of the adjacent possible has become incomparably richer than what it was. Certainly when just one person does this, but when a group of people do this, but imagine if this was the mass consciousness. So In one way, you could say, apart from all the necessary manifest changes that need to be made if the world is going to even physically be a better place, much less about politics and battles and this or that, would be if the consciousness can change. So now there's more possibilities available in the space of the adjacent possible. What can take place is available. And from these different ways of looking at it, you could say the disorder has decreased by more self-organization. You could say in Maslow's hierarchy, the consciousness, the stage of consciousness has evolved. You could say that the information available for solutions to these problems has been organized to a much vaster level than it was on before. But however you look at it, and it isn't so important to go, well, you know, this and then this, but it's realizing this principle of dependent co-arising, that everything is having its impact upon everything else. But the possibilities that can take place, first of all, with each of us awakening to our own higher potentialities. I mean, that can make such a tremendous difference, yes.
Do you think there's a tipping point? I mean, where if enough of us are raised, then everybody else will be raised?
I think it's, I'm glad you asked that question. Is there a tipping point where enough of us get raised to a higher consciousness, everybody will be raised? I talked before about Sheldrake's theory about the morphogenetic hypothesis, that there's kind of a field in organisms and so on. And there's a phenomena that's been demonstrated in science when somebody for the first time synthesizes a very difficult crystal, let's say, crystalline structure. Once someone has done it, it becomes easier for other people to do it, even though maybe the technique has been known. In the New York Times crossword, it's been shown it's easier if you do it the day after it comes out than the day it's there, because more people have done it. I mean, this has been shown. They've done experiments with mice where they've taught them how to run mazes through different, and then they bred them, so the smarter ones, they breed those and so on. But once they do that in some lab over here, then mice of the same species in some other country learn these mazes much more quickly than they did before. And next week's going to be about interconnectedness, so a little sneak preview of that. So my answer to your question is when more and more people evolve to a higher consciousness, and there's no end point to that. You know, I used to think enlightenment, you're done, you know, you get your badge and go to the spiritual retirement community in the sky. Once more and more people awaken to that, then it's going to become a lot easier for other people. And anybody who's ever, again, we've been teaching meditation classes for a long time, and it's a very common phenomenon. Someone who's new to the group comes and says, well, it's so much easier to meditate here than when I try to do it at home. Well, there's a field, there's an energy link up that happens with the group, and it is easier. It is easier when that consciousness becomes available. But that's not a local phenomena. It seems to be. But that change in what's available is available to everything on every level, but it's easier to access in familiar territory. So just a couple more minutes. Anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Wait, so I know there's no real end, but let's say you're closer to the end than we are now. Does the individual cease to exist?
Well, here's a profound question. The question is, does the individual cease to exist when you get closer to the end point? In some systems of, well, Buddhists would say there's not, the way we think of an individual is not a reality. We're like the water in the river. It's never the same water, but the river, and in at least some forms of Buddhism, the idea is to go beyond becoming, non-manifestation, and in yoga, the idea is to, the ultimate state is to dissolve, and it's called nirvikalpa, without seed. You can't describe it anymore. There's no individuality. Sufism says that the purpose of existence is awakening of the divine in life. So at least in Sufism, the purpose is to become much more the individual, but not the separated individual in the usual personal consciousness, but to become what I'd call a human hyphen divine being, not losing our humanity, but manifesting more and more of our divinity in the world. So it depends on what your purpose is. Just a couple more minutes. Any other? Yes.
You know, one of the things you've explained to us is the essentialness of relating, and that really does blow my mind about just that very same question he's talking about, where dissolving into oneness doesn't, it's like that wouldn't be good.
Well, again, it depends on your purpose, but at least some Sufis say, because not all Sufis look at things this way, that higher than unity, because you think, well, unity would be the ultimate thing, you merge back into one. Higher than unity is relationship, because only in relationship can there be the lover and the beloved. And Sufis, that's what it's all about, the lover and the beloved. And so to me, spirituality is much more fulfilling when I understand and believe it to be something that's going to enable more and more to come forth in existence and to bring about a ongoing transformation of manifestation to higher and higher levels, not to negate manifestation. But again, different spiritual systems have their different purposes and so on.